New York City, winter of 1957. A city still rebuilding its spirit, still whispering echoes of the war that reshaped the world. A city where skyscrapers stretch defiantly into grey skies and snow falls like ash onto streets filled with hurried footsteps and quiet sacrifices. And on the southern edge of Central Park, near the frozen boat pond and the rows of iron benches that once hosted Sunday picnics and weekend readings, one of those benches is now occupied not by laughter or lovers, but by a figure nearly swallowed by the fabric of his own coat. A man curled into himself, wrapped in wool long past its prime, his hat pulled low, his breath rising slowly in the fry. Gid air like steam from a forgotten kettle. He is old, or at least he looks it, not the kind of old measured in years, but in loss, in silence, in nights passed without a bed, in the weight of memories too stubborn to leave and too painful to share. And though he lies still, unmoving except for the rhythmic shiver that runs through his shoulders each time the wind knifes down the avenue, he's not entirely asleep, nor fully awake. He's suspended, held between a world that rushes past and one he cannot return to. People pass without turning their heads. A businessman with leather gloves and urgent steps, a nanny pushing a stroller, a couple arm in arm discussing tomorrow's dinner. They see the coat, perhaps, or the shape under it, but not the man. For in a city that never sleeps, some stories are buried not beneath the ground, but beneath indifference, beneath the noise of moving on, beneath the everyday rhythm of survival. But that day, a boy stops. His name is Tommy, 9 years old, coat too big, shoes scuffed from sidewalk baseball, hands cold but eyes wide, the kind of wide that sees not just what's in front of him, but what's behind it. He's just left the library, a tattered copy of The Red Badge of Courage sticking out of his backpack, and he notices the man not as an obstacle or a warning, but as someone who, like the hero in his book, might be carrying something invisible, something heavy, something worth asking about. As Tommy steps closer, cautiously, respectfully, curiously, he notices a shimmer barely there, a glint of metal tucked beneath the folds of the man's coat, and with a breath held more out of awe than fear, he gently reaches to touch it. A badge, circular, tarnished but unmistakable, with the outline of an eagle engraved in its center. Not the kind sold in pawn shops or pressed into trinkets, but the kind given in ceremony, earned in fire, held with pride. He looks up at the man, who slowly opens his eyes, tired, glassy but not empty, and asks the only question that feels right in that moment. "Sir, what is this?" And it is then, with that one question, that the story begins. A story not of battles fought in distant fields, but of promises made and nearly forgotten, of names erased and memory reborn. A story that will ripple across generations and reshape the meaning of one boy's kindness, one man's silence, and one badge that refused to be buried. If this story touches you the way it touched me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep telling stories that move, inspire, and remind us what really matters. And now, brace yourself, because what happens next will change everything. Every afternoon, Tommy returned to that same frozen bench beside the pond in Central Park, pulling his tattered red scarf tight around his neck, the wind tugging at his coat as though trying to steal away warmth, carrying with him a brown paper bag wrapped in waxed paper that his mother packed each morning. A sandwich, sometimes apples, sometimes a flask of hot cocoa when she could spare sugar. Because Tommy sensed, even before he understood, that simple kindness might be the first thing to crack a man's silence, and so he approached, careful of the crunch of snow under his boots, mindful of not startling the man curled in the coat, whose edges were ragged and whose fabric had grown thin in places, threadbare and patched, but still holding something more than cold: pride, memory, pain. Tommy watched the man for days before speaking, noticing how his breath clouded in the cold air, how his fingers, wrapped inside faded gloves, shook each time a gust of wind swept by, how there were moments just at dusk when the street lamps flickered on, that he would shift slightly, as if trying to remember the warmth of a fire or the hush of someone calling his name, but then sink back into stillness. And Tommy, with his notebook half open, pencil poised but never quite writing, felt something in his chest. Unease, curiosity, compassion, because the man was more than a fixture on a bench, more than a silhouette against winter's gloom. He was lost to some invisible map, someone who carried a story, perhaps unbearable, perhaps unfinished. On the fourth day, Tommy took the seat across the path, sat with the paper bag on his knee, and said, "Excuse me, sir, would you like some cocoa?" The man stirred, raised a hand, voice low and rough. "Thank you," he said, not much louder than the wind, but enough. His name, when he said it, sounded like a confession: James Walker. At hearing this, Tommy nodded, managed a shy smile, and offered half the sandwich, breaking it in two, as though splitting more than bread, splitting shame, splitting hunger, splitting fear. James Walker didn't immediately open up, yet the presence of Tommy began to draw him out, like winter sun through frost. Small stories, begun with pauses, murmured pieces of a past life, boardwalks along the Atlantic in childhood, enlistment in the army at 19, training in a camp far away, letters home smelling of sweat and rain, transports across the sea, nights filled with the distant thunder of bombs, the smell of diesel and blood, comrades lost in silence, the name Robert whispered too many times in darkness. Yes, Tommy listened, eyes wide, heart pounding like distant drums, scrawling the words in his notebook when James paused, so the story would not vanish with the wind. At home, Tommy's mother noticed he returned later, boots wet, face pale, hands trembling. She asked quietly, "Who is he?" Tommy said nothing at first, just that he brings the man cocoa and listens. The mother frowned at first, but saw the care in her son's eyes, and something shifted: respect, sorrow, hope. The grandmother, who had kept a photograph of her missing brother Robert in an old battered frame, saw Tommy humming a melody she only half remembered. A military tune, wartime dispatch, something sweet and bitter. She asked Tommy where he learned it. Tommy said, "From the man on the bench." One evening, the grandmother came with Tommy to the park, dusk bluish and sharp, the air biting, lampposts glowing, snowflakes drifting. Tommy guided her to the bench. James was there, wrapping his coat closer. The grandmother hesitated, then approached. James looked up. Their eyes met, a tremor in his voice. "Ma'am," she said, "I'm Evelyn Walker." In that moment, neither spoke of blame or loss, only recognition, that silent thing people carry when someone else knows their name, remembers what they thought forgotten. Tommy waited. James stood uncertain, yet Evelyn stepped forward reverently and touched the badge peeking from inside James's coat, the same badge Tommy had seen him uncover for the first time. Evelyn's hand shook. Tears slid without sound. She saw not just metal, but history, promise, a brother she thought lost, a life she believed vanished. And James, with eyes moist, whispered that Robert had asked him, in their last days, to deliver this badge to his sister if he could not survive. Evelyn held it. The cold metal burned in her palm with something alive: memory. From then on, Tommy's visits became less furtive and more regular. He brought soup, notebooks, music, stories. James would sit upright, telling fragments, letters he never mailed, names on enlistment rolls, nights under foreign stars, the taste of snow melting on lips in a foreign war. Tommy scribbled, asked what it meant to carry guilt, to survive, to remember. Evelyn listened, sometimes with her own gifts. She brought photographs of Robert, old letters she had kept in a drawer, yellowed by time, the uniform jacket her brother wore, buttons missing, fabric torn, beloved and haunting. Neighbors began to notice the boy walking solemnly to the bench, the elderly man speaking softly to him, the grandmother standing quietly listening. Passers-by paused. Children asked their parents, "Who is he?" A policeman's nod. Someone left a blanket. A stranger offered gloves. Nothing grand, but everyday gestures accumulating like dew. James's posture straightened. His voice, though rough, carried less of a burden of shame and more of something like purpose. He began to hum military songs again, not out of pride, but remembrance, a hymn for Robert, for comrades, for himself. And the boy's gaze, curious and kind, became his mirror. Whatever words he thought lost, whatever silence he thought permanent, found resonance in the child's attention. And still, Tommy did not know the full ending, but he felt the turning of something heavy, a promise long held, a name whispered, a life reclaimed, and believed that perhaps one day soon the city would remember. After several more afternoons of sitting quietly beside the pond, Tommy finally coaxed James Walker to share more, not because James suddenly trusted everyone, but because Tommy's presence carried a kind of permission, a light in the winter dusk that made James feel less invisible, less burdened by things he'd carried in silence for too long. So one evening, as snow drifted across the benches and street lamps flickered through icy mist, James pulled from an inner pocket a folded, stained piece of cloth wrapped around a medal, a badge, and offered it to Tommy without speaking at first, letting the metal glint in the lamplight, letting Tommy sense that this small object was heavy, not just in weight, but in memory. James spoke then of 1944, of France under occupation, of nights spent in cellars where the walls dripped with damp and fear, of safe houses hidden behind bakeries and churches, families smuggled out through dark alleyways, children's lullabies swallowed by whispering bombs overhead. He told of his friend Robert, whose steady hands saved James's life more than once, a calm voice in moments of chaos, laughter even when ration lines were long and food was scarce. Robert was the brother James never had, the brother who gave him the badge on a night when they both knew one of them might not see morning. A round medallion with an eagle rising from stars, with "for bravery" inscribed faintly, scuffed by mud and war, but still proud. Robert fell when the SS came knocking on doors, when betrayals split families, when loud boots echoed through narrow streets and people turned away, hiding in shadows. He died alone under debris, and in his final breath he handed James that badge, saying, "If I don't make it back, you carry this for me, you find my sister." And James, clutching tears that had no sound, nodded, vowing to keep the promise, even though the world seemed to have forgotten how to honor such vows, even though after the war ended, when flags came down and reconstruction began, when churches reopened and children refilled school benches, the deep hurts of things unsaid and people missing remained beneath clean surfaces, bleeding quietly in quiet hearts. Tommy listened, notebook open, pencil poised, writing down line by line Robert's name, safe houses, betrayal, nights of cold and hunger, the taste of bread broken in two, the smell of wet coats, the glare of searchlights, the echo of boots. Every detail that made the memory real, that made the silence trembling. And in that listening, something shifted. James's shoulders dropped some of the weight. His voice, hoarse, scratched by shame and regret, grew steadier, carried the weight of words finally spoken. He told Tommy of his return to New York after the war, of walking off the troop ship into chaos, of heavy coats and heavier expectations, of finding Robert's name missing in old letters, missing in registries, missing in newspaper lists of war dead, of the endless chase of addresses, the constant knock. "Do you know Miss Walker?" And always a shake of the head, always a "I'm sorry" from clerks worn by grief and bureaucracy, always one more closed door. He spoke of nights when he could barely sleep, haunted by images of Robert in rubble, of silence where voices should have been, of people who walked past him on benches like this one, pretending not to see. He told Tommy he hid the badge in his coat pocket, sometimes pressing it under his chest when the city seemed coldest, sometimes taking it out in the dark just to feel the engraving under his thumb, to remember the promise, to refuse forgetting. Tommy, whose education had given him maps of battles and dates of treaties, but few stories of what it felt like to wait, started to understand something deeper, that heroism isn't always measured in medals, the kind you display in a frame, but in promises kept, in memories held, in the courage to speak when most choose silence. He asked James, "Why didn't you talk before?" James said, "Because who listens to a man on a bench? Because I thought by speaking I'd flood the world with my regrets, and people don't like regret. But you listen." One cold morning, James gave Tommy a packet of old letters, tied with string, fragile with yellowed edges, addressed to Sister Mary Walker. Letters Robert had written but never mailed, hopeful and afraid, full of longing for peace, for home, for simple things, resting by a hearth, bread warmed by fire, laughter without fear. Tommy's hands shook. He read to James, voice trembling, the part where Robert wrote, "This badge I leave you. If I fall, keep it safe, let it speak for me." And in that moment, Tommy felt that the world could still be changed by one small act. Acknowledgement, by one boy, one man, one badge. And though James did not know whether Robert's sister was still alive, whether she would ever know, whether the past could ever be made whole, Tommy sensed that the promise carried itself forward, that someone must remember, that someone must witness, that memory is not merely backward-facing but forward-moving, that by telling this story, the wound begins to heal, not just in one man, but in a city's conscience. Tommy closed the notebook, thanked James, and walked home through snow that seemed less cold than before. There was purpose in his steps, something like hope. Because even in the cold, even in the silence, a badge had been found, and through it a mission born. A soft, grey morning in mid-February arrived, the kind in New York where the sky looks like lead, and the snow beside sidewalks is already dirty from passing cars and salt. And Tommy's grandmother, Evelyn Walker, woke with a strange tightness in her chest, a memory she couldn't quite name, a photograph she pulled from an old drawer. It showed a young man in uniform, strong-jawed, smiling, arm around another soldier, a moment of sunlight behind them. Robert, her brother, lost to war, missing in action in Europe. No letters after 1944, no confirmation of what became of him, only the ache of not knowing. She held the photo in trembling hands, stared at the badge pinned on his chest. For bravery, she had once been told, its edges shining, its meaning heavy, and then set it down, resolve forming like frost on a window pane. She would go to the park with Tommy, to see the man on the bench, to see what name his badge bore, to see if she could find what years had hidden. Tommy, who had grown in those previous weeks to understand that some stories live in silence until someone dares to ask, felt the weight of his grandmother's grief in her eyes when she clasped his hand and stood by the bench where James Walker was sitting, coat pulled tight, scarf thin, the snow falling in flakes that seemed to pause in midair. Evelyn approached, the photograph folded in her coat pocket, fingers warmed by hot coffee she'd nursed in a thermos. James looked up, startled, as though he recognized something in the woman's expression, though he did not yet know her, heart beating with a memory unspoken. When Evelyn spoke, her voice was steady, though her lips quivered. "My name is Evelyn Walker." James's face changed, surprise, dread, then something like hope. He stood, muttered her name, Walker. And in that moment, Tommy saw the lines around James's eyes soften, the stiffness of his back ease just a little. Evelyn pulled the photo from her pocket and unfolded it carefully, holding it out so James could see. The man in the photograph, uniformed, smiling, was Robert, her brother, and the badge pinned to his chest matched the one peeking from James's coat. Tears blurred Evelyn's vision as she placed the photo next to James's chest, near the badge, the cold metal cool against her palm, but warm in meaning as though it carried Robert's voice. "This was him," she whispered. "You knew him." James closed his eyes, pressed a hand over his heart, the badge undercoat pressing back. He nodded, voice thick. "We were brothers in arms. He gave me this badge on a night when everything was against us and asked me to bring it home." Evelyn placed her hand lightly on his, trembling. "Robert asked me to hope," she said. "I thought him gone. I thought the war had stolen him forever." Tommy stood between them, snow melting on his shoes, watching grandmother and stranger become something different, mother and son of a promise, family unfinished but found. James retrieved a faded letter, yellowed at the edges, from his coat pocket and handed it to Evelyn. She unfolded it, reading lines written in Robert's hand. Words of wanting to survive, of missing hearth and home, of praying someone would remember his name. Evelyn's shoulders shook. She closed her eyes. Tommy felt a warmth inside him, as though the winter were pushing back. Neighbors passing by paused. A man with a briefcase slowed his step. A woman pushing a baby stroller stopped, gloved hand pressed over her heart. Someone offered James a blanket. Evelyn placed the photograph and the letter on the bench between them. No one spoke. The air carried weight. Above the crunch of snow and distant hum of traffic, there was something like a hush. The city seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn raised her head and said softly, "You kept a promise, James." James swallowed, voice breaking. "I carried this badge, this promise, in my coat. Through nights I could not sleep, through mornings I nearly forgot why, but I didn't forget." Tommy looked up, cold air filling his lungs, tears in his eyes, but a steady pride. Pride in his grandmother, pride in James, pride in himself for asking, "What is this?" weeks ago. From that day forward, the benches in Central Park felt different. People who once passed James with indifference now greeted him with nods. Children lingered when they saw Tommy and Evelyn sitting beside James, warm coffee steaming, Robert's photograph unhidden, the badge shining softly. James began to speak more openly, about loss, about guilt, about courage, not to be forgiven, but to be known. Evelyn often listened, sometimes sharing her own stories of childhood during rationing, of letters that came late, of the brother she believed gone but never forgot. Tommy kept his notebook, pages filling with Robert's letters, photographs, the badge's design, the stories of safe houses and nighttime escapes. He asked James about dangers, about fear, about what it means to pick up someone else's story and carry it. James answered with a voice hoarse with grief but firm with truth, because some losses call out for witnesses. Evelyn, holding her brother's photograph, held too the wound of decades, but in that wound there was healing, because at last a brother's promise had been honored. In the weeks that followed, the story spread. Local papers ran human interest pieces, badge and promise reunited, a family restored, from bench to belonging. Headlines drawing attention, not pity, but respect. Schoolchildren came, held up sketches of Robert's uniform, asked questions that mattered. What does bravery cost? What do you do with a promise when everyone else has moved on? And James, with Evelyn at his side, answered, "You hold it, you tell it, you pass it on." And though Tommy still did not know the full ending, whether Robert's name would be honored on some memorial, whether his mother had lived to see this day, he understood that some tears are not marks of defeat, but of remembrance, that some promises become larger than their original bearers. He knew that asking, "What is this?" I had changed not just one life, but many. Grandmother, man, boy, had become a single story of memory, love, and respect, unfolding in the cold that would melt and in hearts that would remember. In the weeks that followed the revelation between Evelyn Walker and James Walker, beside the cold, snow-dusted bench in Central Park, the story of the badge, the promise, and the lost brother began to unfold outward like ripples in still water, reaching corners of the neighborhood Billy, Tommy, and his grandmother had never anticipated, stirring in people a mixture of sorrow, admiration, regret, and hope. So that one chilly afternoon, a reporter from the New York Times stopped by the park with notebook in hand, drawn by whispers of man on bench, boy who listened, promise kept. And after speaking with Tommy and Evelyn and James, penned a feature article titled, "A Promise Remembered, Badge, Brother and Boy," which ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. And what happened next felt unreal in its gravity, because suddenly there came letters from veterans, from strangers, from families who had their own missing pieces, offering blankets, hot coffee, kind words, and above all ears to hear, arms to acknowledge, hands to give comfort, as if the city, too long indifferent, was waking up. Neighbors who months before had crossed the street to avoid an older man sleeping on a bench now paused, offered a glove or a newspaper, or simply nodded respectfully when passing by. Community groups, lodges of veterans, the local VFW hall began inviting James to meetings, not to be ignored, but to be heard, to share his memories, to hold that badge in his palm in rooms filled with people who understood that remembrance is both burden and blessing. Local school teachers, hearing about Tommy's notebook, asked him to bring his stories into the classroom. And with trembling pride, he stood before children whose coats smelled of wet snow, who listened as James spoke of Robert, the safe houses, the nights of fear, the mornings of loss, not to instill pity but understanding, so that young hearts would know that bravery is not only in battle, but in survival, in carrying memory when silence presses. The city government could no longer ignore the stirring around the bench. The Parks Department was petitioned. The Art Commission considered a plaque. On a crisp Saturday morning, just as spring began to thaw the frozen pond, a small dedication ceremony was held at that same bench. Tommy stood beside James and Evelyn as the mayor read a proclamation. In honor of all those who carry promises in silence and all those who listen, this bench shall be known as Robert's Promise Bench, a reminder that remembrance is not forgetting, that acknowledgement is justice. The plaque, made of bronze, simple in design but profound in message, was affixed to the back of the bench so that those who sat might see its inscription. Here sat James Walker, who bore a brother's badge, a boy's faith, and a city's memory. During that ceremony, James, though frail, stood straighter than he had in years. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Tommy held the badge carefully, wrapped in cloth, his eyes glistening in the sunlight, and the crowd around them. Old veterans in caps, mothers with children, pedestrians who had once passed him by, pressed in quietly, some with tears, others with clasped hands, but all with a sense that something sacred had been restored, something lost had been restored, not to its original form, but in part to its dignity. From that day forward, people no longer saw James Walker as merely a homeless man or a forgotten veteran, but as a keeper of promise, as living history. Community members invited him into local veteran centers. His weather-worn stories were recorded on tape by neighborhood historians. Churches read his name in Sunday prayers. Newspapers ran follow-ups asking, "What is memory worth? And why do we honor the small acts of courage?" People who once judged by appearance now paused to listen. The bench itself became a gathering place, for kids after school, for older folks in the evening, for people who simply wanted to remember. Tommy, who once came alone with cocoa and bread, now came with friends, with schoolmates, with his notebook full of Robert's letters, with sketches of soldiers' boots, old uniforms, badges like the one James carried. He read aloud from the notebook in front of small audiences. "Robert asked me to take this, so someone would remember." Uda and Evelyn, sometimes silent, sometimes speaking, told her own memories. Her brother's laughter, the letters that smelled of ash and rain, the uniform jacket tucked away in a cedar box, the longing and the hope she could not extinguish. Meanwhile, James, in his small room in the veteran's home, looked out the window toward the park, toward the bench with its blended wood, weathered and bronze plaque shining in morning light, and felt gratitude wash through him. Gratitude at being seen, being heard, being remembered. He still held the badge sometimes, pressed it against his chest on cold nights, spoke the name Robert aloud when the world was quiet. He no longer slept on the bench, no longer shielded by shadows, because his promise had moved into daylight. There were no grand monuments built, no military parades in his honor, no medals pinned on his coat by generals, none of the loud gestures he once believed would matter. But something greater had happened. His community had recognized him. His silence had become part of a shared memory. His promise had become a bond that tied generations together. And in that, he found a form of honor that years of struggle and loss could not take away. As spring unfurled into summer, children played around the bench, reading books, laughing, snow replaced by green leaves, and for those who passed by, the bench bore witness to the boy who asked, the man who held, the family who remembered, and a city that chose to acknowledge. James Walker no longer sleeps on the park bench that once cradled his silence. Not because time healed all wounds, nor because the world suddenly became kind, but because someone finally asked, because a boy chose to see him not as a shadow in the snow, but as a man carrying something sacred. Now in a quiet room at the veterans' home overlooking the park, James sits by the window where sunlight falls across a small wooden frame. The same badge once hidden beneath layers of cloth and regret, now clean, polished, and finally honored. The badge no longer represents just a war long over, but the weight of a promise held through loneliness, through decades of being unheard. A promise fulfilled not in a courtroom or with fanfare, but in a boy's question, in a grandmother's recognition, in the collective decision of a city to listen when it had long forgotten how. Tommy still visits the bench, no longer just a place where someone once slept, but now a space where memory breathes. He reads aloud from his notebook, tells the story to students and strangers alike, teaches that some heroes wear no uniform, that some battles continue in silence, that dignity can return in a single act of empathy. Evelyn walks beside him, her eyes softer now, the photo of her brother no longer a mystery, but a memory with a voice again. When James passed, they gathered not to grieve what was lost, but to honor what was finally found. A life restored to meaning, a legacy once buried now rooted in the soil of remembrance. The plaque on the bench reads simply, "Here sat James Walker, a man who carried a promise and gave it back to the world." And maybe that's what we all need. Not to be famous, not to be written in history books, but to be remembered truthfully, wholly, with all the weight of who we were and the tenderness of who we tried to be. If this story touched you the way it touched me while writing it, please like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling real stories, stories that move us, that heal us, that remind us what truly matters.